ladies. I hope all is well with you. Just wanted to come back to you and briefly talk about genetic testing. I'm in the midst of my 2-week wait. It feels like it's been way longer than 2 weeks. And I'm towards the latter end of it. So while I wait, I figure I just talk about genetic testing and why I decided, or we decided not to do it. So first and foremost, for us, it would have been PGS testing, and my doctor's office, maybe they all do this, I don't know, requires before you, even if you're not sure, before you feel that you want to go through with genetic testing, you need to talk to the genetic counselor who happens to be a nurse. So I spoke with her because originally I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do genetic testing or not. I figure, why not? My husband and I, in the very initial stages of this process, when we did all the testing and all the blood work and all of that stuff, we did a whole panel full of genetic tests just to see if we were carriers for anything. I couldn't tell you what they test. They test a lot of different things, a ton of tests. And my husband came back not being, for the things they test for, not being a carrier for anything, which, is pretty good, I guess, to not be a carrier. And one of the nurses said that that's rare because most people are a carrier for something. So he's probably a carrier for something, maybe just not what they tested. I don't know. I, on the other hand, came back being not a carrier per se, but having a higher chance of being a carrier for spinal muscular atrophy, something I had never heard of. And they couldn't even say I was a carrier. They said I had a higher risk of being a carrier. So I don't know, whatever that means. So I had never heard of the disease before. I don't know anyone in my family who has the disease, but my mother is adopted. So there's a portion of the family that I'm not biologically, that I'm not as familiar with. But as far as I knew, no one in our family had that disease because it's a pretty horrible disease. And, a whole lot of stuff. You can Google it if you're interested, but it's pretty deadly and all that horrible stuff. But as I said, I didn't know anyone in my family who had actually had it. So it wasn't a big concern, though, because one, they couldn't confirm that I was a carrier. And even if I was a carrier, my husband would also have to be a carrier, which he wasn't. So we weren't at risk because both parents would have to be a carrier to be at risk to have a child that had that disease. So it wasn't really an issue for us, but I just wanted to try to be extra cautious and see if we should consider genetic testing given the results. And long story short, no, we shouldn't, or we didn't. So when I first was on the phone with her, and I spoke to this genetic counselor prior to doing the egg retrieval, prior to starting the stimulation shots. So it was a little while ago, and I did it on the phone. And when we first, it was about an hour actually, the conversation. When we first got on the phone, we went through my family history. And we went through my husband's family history, and she wanted to know everyone, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your siblings, nieces, nephews, anything you have, how old they are, if they're deceased, what was the cause, if they're alive, do they have any major health problems, if they are deceased, how old they were when they passed. So it was just, very detailed, a lot of the information, especially going back on my husband's side. And as I said, my mother's adopted. So a portion of her side, I'm just like, I don't know. No one told me I needed to, do ancestry.com or anything before I got on the phone with the genetic counselor or really research it. So I hadn't. I just thought we could get on there and kind of chat, which we did. And the fact that I didn't have some of that information was okay because, as I said, we weren't at a higher risk. I know, a lot of African Americans, people of African descent may have risk of sickle cell, and neither one of us was a carrier for that. And, various other ethnicities have different types, are carriers or higher carriers for other types of diseases. So one thing that was a factor into why we decided not to do it is because since we weren't these huge carriers for anything or really have a high risk, I doubt my insurance was going to pay for it. So as we all know, this is a bit of a lengthy process. And sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I took notes while I was talking with her. This is a bit of a lengthy and expensive process. And for me, as I've already discussed, insurance is playing a major role. And without that, thank God, I would not be doing this. I'm not going to say I would have self-financed. I can't say I know that you can write off a lot of these expenses as far as in your tax deductions and all of that and claim it on your tax. But I'm not saying I would have done that. I don't know. Maybe not, I know people are families, women, couples, they go through a lot. They finance, they, tap into their retirement, all types of stuff that they need to do to pay for this. And I commend each and every one of them. I'm not saying I would have done that if not for insurance, but thank God I have pretty good insurance that covers, as I said, way more than most of this. So as long as it's as long as it's medically necessary. And so that gets into the genetic testing. Because I don't really have anything that would put me at risk or my child at risk, the insurance was likely not going to cover it. And I'd already spoken with the insurance, and they said they would cover it, but it had to be pre-approved. And for that, meaning that there had to really be a reason why they should cover it. And, probably wasn't going to get approved. And I didn't know if I felt strongly enough about it to push the issue. So basically, I'm going to talk about the cost first. For me, at the facility that I go to, the minimum cost was $4,000. That was for the first 3 embryos. Now, as we all know, I only had 3 embryos, but that's for the first 3 embryos. And $2,500 of that was the base price, was for biopsy, I'm sorry. And base price for testing was just the $1,500. So they have to biopsy the embryos. And then after the first 3, if you're one of the lucky ones who has more than 3 embryos, then it was $425 per embryo up to your next 8 embryos. So it's 3, then 8. And then if you have even more than that, after that additional 8 is $200 per embryo. So, so if you have a whole lot of embryos and you want to get them all tested, or a lot of them tested, that was the cost. And they had different packages for how we could do it. And so you could just decide up front that you wanted to test. And I could say, yeah, I wanted to test. And then we would do what I just discussed as far as the pricing, first 3 being $4,000. And they test the embryos on the 5th or 6th day. Now, as we know, a lot of embryos do not survive to the 5th or 6th day. And so if none of your embryos survive for the 5th or 6th day, then you had to pay a $700 cancellation fee because you had no embryos. So you have no embryos and you have to pay a $700 fee. Was that fair? I don't know. The other option was so that was if you want to test all your embryos up front. So if I had tested the 3 that I had without doing the transfer, I would have, decided to just test all 3 up front. So the other option was to do a fresh transfer and to test any leftovers. So, again, if you're lucky enough to have some embryos to transfer fresh, and then as I did, I transferred I transferred 2 on 3 days. And then I had 1 embryo left over. So in that case, I could have tested that 1 embryo. They push the leftover embryos out to 5 or 6 days, which is when they do the biopsy for the testing, and then freeze them. So then you would pay if you decided to do it that way, but you were able to transfer some and then have some in backup. And the ones that were backed up would have been tested, but the ones that you transferred wouldn't have. And then the third option, which is the one I possibly would have been most likely to do, is for the undecided patient. And you sign up for PGS testing, but you don't really commit. And if you can't decide, so you had a certain amount of days where you could decide. And if you didn't decide to do it, you could cancel without a fee. And so that was the one I would have most likely done. However, I just didn't feel that for us PGS was important and seemed like a little more of a hassle. If you feel you need to do it or you want to do it, it's completely a personal decision, just like most of this. Almost everything in these infertility process is completely personal. What's right for one person or one family is not right for everyone else, and vice versa. But so I just felt it wasn't really important to me, and I don't think that my husband cared. As a couple, we had no indications, and honestly, the doctor didn't necessarily recommend that we do it. I mean, they'll let you do whatever you want to do if you pay for it, right? They'll let you do whatever you want to do, but they didn't recommend it for us. So I knew insurance was not going to pay for it. So the thing about PGS is it tests for abnormal chromosomes or chromosomal, I can't say the word now, abnormalities. So they're looking for good quality embryos. And sometimes good quality embryos can have those abnormalities. I'm never going to try to say it again. Chromosomal. There you go. I think that's right. Abnormalities. And sometimes good, as I said, good quality embryos can have that and still develop into a perfectly healthy child. So sometimes this can be a little controversial because PGS testing can lead you to think that an embryo will develop abnormally or have some sort of issue, and there is a chance that it wouldn't. And so if you're a person who feels that you need to test your embryos, and then they come to you and tell you that they wouldn't recommend testing or wouldn't recommend transferring, I don't know, any number of them because of chromosomal abnormalities, then I mean, you have a hard decision, because there have been situations where women have fought, especially when they don't have a lot of embryos, they have fought to have those embryos transferred, and they have implanted and developed into healthy children and babies. So, there is that. So it's not a foolproof situation. So, so she gave me some stats. She said 1 in 50 or 0.67%, so it's less than 1% chance that a baby will have chromosomal abnormalities. Now, when you're pregnant, now that's one that's born. Now, when you're pregnant, in the first 3 months, we all know, is when things are the riskiest. That's why a lot of women do not tell people they're pregnant for the first 3 months. It's because nature has this way of weeding out embryos or babies that very likely have these abnormalities and may or may not survive and maybe shouldn't be there. I mean, nature has its way of doing it. That's why miscarriages are so high in the first 3 months. It's because, unfortunately, even though you were pregnant and, you may, whether it was through IVF or anything else, unfortunately, that child may not, I mean, not always, but just due to whatever chromosomal issues that were going on, that child probably wouldn't have survived. And so nature, your body, will naturally abort or miscarry. So for the first 3 months of pregnancy, it's a 1 in 86 chance of having a miscarriage based on those chromosomal abnormalities. Now, 57% of embryos tested will be normal. So in my case, had I tested any of them, they recommended that I put in 2. But they recommended 2 almost under any circumstances. I guess maybe, I don't know. I didn't get to 5 days. I only had 3 embryos. And I think because of the small number, my doctor decided to just not even risk pushing him out to 5 days and went ahead for a 3-day transfer for the 2. And also to transfer 2 to give me a higher chance of at least one of them implanting. But also, given if you don't do any type of PGS, you could just transfer 2, again, giving yourself a higher chance of one implanting. And if there is one that has abnormalities, it either may not implant, or if it does, I mean, either way, I guess even if it does implant, you could miscarry, unfortunately. So for me, the way they looked at it is they looked at the age of delivery. So since I'm 35 now, by the time I gave birth, assuming everything worked out, I would be 36. So I was told right off the bat that most women my age do not test, unless they had some indications as to why, or a family history or something like that. They just, as I said, they just transfer 2 and take their chances. And we talked about the chances of multiples here, where how, of course, transferring 2, you can end up with 2 or more. But even just, and I don't know if people are as aware, but IVF in itself gives you a higher chance of multiple. So even if you transfer 1, just, I don't know what it is. And I mean, I've been researching and looking into it, and I did transfer 2, but if you transfer 1, there's a higher chance with IVF that 1 will split and you can get identical twins, or split twice and you can have identical triplets from the 1 embryo. And so I guess by transferring 2 embryos, there is a chance of sextuplets, maybe? I don't know. Don't want to think about it. Who knows? But I think it's a really small chance. But it can still split. And then, given that I did ICSI, or they did ICSI for all 3 of my embryos, and they did ICSI given the small number, they wanted to make sure that the 3 I had guaranteed that they at least were to, I guess, fertilize. ICSI apparently also gives you a higher chance of the eggs splitting. I don't know. I mean, it's, it's all scientific. Everything's very scientific, but that's just the way it is. Some of the stuff I've been researching. So if you're doing PGS, of course, that happens after they fertilize the embryos. So, or whether that's through ICSI or the other way they do it, whatever that is. And then they would push the embryos, as I said, day 5 or 6. Then they biopsy them. And they biopsy them by taking 5 cells from the embryos, which I asked whether it hurt the embryos and not whether they can physically feel it. I mean, that's a good question too, but I'm sure they can't. I like to think they can't, right? But more so whether it would damage the embryos. So I'll get back to that. So after they biopsy them, they freeze them. Now, of course, they have to make it to the 5 days to even get biopsy. And then once they're biopsied, they're frozen. And then, so that pushes you out if you're going to do, if you want to transfer. So if you don't want to transfer right away, you have them biopsied and they're frozen, and you're waiting. I think you're waiting a couple of weeks while you get the results of the PGS. So they freeze them during that time. And then after you get your results and you get your recommendations on what to transfer, what not to transfer, what have you, then you have to do a frozen cycle. So if you do this, you can't transfer right away. You have to, it pushes you off for at least another month at earliest. And you'd have to, again, prepare your body through various shots to do a frozen transfer later. So which, you know, is another risk because sometimes frozen embryos do not survive being thawed out. So it's just every step, every additional layer, everything you do, there's always a new risk. And I guess that's just life. So back to damaged embryos. So I was told that there was a less than 1% chance that it could damage the embryos. So not no, but less than 1% chance. So as I said, the embryos must last 5 or 6 days, and so they stay in the lab longer. The fact is most embryos don't last 5 or 6 days. It's something about the lab. It's something about sometimes they just don't. So I know everyone thinks that doing a blastocyst 5-day, 6-day transfer is the best thing. It's, you know, maybe even a 4-day transfer, some places do, is the best thing to do. And for some women it is. But if your embryos cannot survive that long, you may be forced to do a 3-day transfer. And unfortunately, you only know if your embryos can't survive when they die out. So then you'll have to do it, you know, again. So it's just, sometimes it's best to, unless you feel you really have to do it because you have a genetic issue that you're worried about, it may or may not be, you know, the best thing to do. Or unless you have miscarriages. Women who've had a lot of miscarriages in the past, or at least, I shouldn't say a lot, but some miscarriages in the past may also want to do genetic testing just to figure out why they were having, to help them figure out why they were having miscarriages. So yeah, and then there's unseen damage. So there's no studies that children born. So if you have PGS done on an embryo and it implants and you're pregnant and yeah, that's great. There's no studies that that child, given that those 5 cells were taken to biopsy, will have any problems. So that was something I was curious about. And also, just because you did PGS does not mean that there's guaranteed that that embryo will implant. So you can do PGS and they could recommend the embryo for transfer because it genetically seems sound. But then, as with everything, that embryo still may not implant, or it may implant and you may still miscarry. So doing PGS does not make you immune to miscarriages. And, you know, it's just life. So back to the process. As I said, they take 5 cells from the embryos, and they look at them for those chromosomal abnormalities. But PGS only tests for large problems. It does not test for small problems. And when I say small problems, I don't mean that it's not a big deal. It's just that they test for large chromosomal abnormalities, like large kinks in the chain, but they don't see the tiny breaks in there. So it could be something that's wrong that they don't see, or sometimes because of that, the results can be unclear. And if the results are unclear, then they will retest based off what's left from that original biopsy of the 5 cells. Or push comes to shove, and I guess I'm sure the parents would have say in this, they could unthaw the embryos, biopsy them again, or the ones that are unclear, and then rethaw them. So, I mean, that's a lot on a little embryo, and I don't think it was a recommended way to go, but because let's just think about it. They had to already survive 5 or 6 days. They were biopsied. They had to survive that. Then they're frozen. Then the biopsy they couldn't figure out whatever from the biopsy, and they don't have enough genetic material left over, so they have to biopsy again. So they're thawed out, which that is another stage where the embryos may not survive. Biopsy them again, and then freeze them again. And then when you are assuming that this embryo is one that's worthy of transferring, when you're ready to transfer it, it has to be thawed again. So it seems like a highly risky situation that throughout all the testing and thawing and biopsying and freezing that you could lose it. And if you don't, I mean, maybe that's a super embryo. So, you know, good luck with that. So yeah, so, and even if you do PGS, the nurse told me that they still recommend you get an amniocentesis. I think I said that one right. Because PGS can miss things. So just because you did PGS testing does not mean that you have caught everything, like I said. And things that it does not test for is it cannot tell you whether the child will be autistic. It cannot tell you whether the child has Down syndrome, I believe. So there are some things, I don't think it could tell you about Down syndrome because it's a more genetic thing, which I don't think Down syndrome is. But it doesn't test for anything or everything, sorry. So there are still some concerns that amniocentesis could test for. Like I know that can detect Down syndrome. I don't know what can detect autism at this point. But so there are different tests, so you still would do that even if you did do PGS testing. And then the results of PGS testing is that you could have a false positive. So that is when they call it abnormal and they don't recommend transferring, but it's actually fine. So that's a false positive, like it was positive for having an abnormality, but it was actually fine. And that's going back to the situation where I said is that sometimes they will say that they don't recommend using it. And then a baby that grew from that embryo could actually be healthy, be fine, be the next president. Who knows? But they recommended not using it. I mean, it could also be the next Hitler. So, maybe you shouldn't use it. There's a false negative. And so that's the opposite of the false positive. So that's when they say it's fine, use it, and it actually is abnormal. So in that case, it could miscarry or not. And then I guess you deal with the consequences or, you deal with what you have to deal with if it doesn't. Then there was the other option is transfer with caution. And this is really a situation where you either have no normal embryos or you're down to the very end of your embryos and the only ones left are transfer with caution. And this is where they do a biopsy, and some of the cells that they biopsied were normal and some were abnormal. And so it's like flip a coin. Basically, they're like, okay, do it if you want to. We don't know what'll happen. And then, of course, there's the normal ones that you would transfer, which is that they recommend transferring, which I guess are ideal. So it's funny because you don't really know for certain. Even with those results, there's no 100% because they can tell you to transfer and there was a problem that PGS could not detect or did not detect for whatever reason, or they can tell you not to transfer and it could have been a beautiful, healthy, wonderful baby. So it's all types of uncertainty with that. And given the uncertainty, given the cost, given the fact that as a couple, we did not have any indicators and we weren't really at risk for anything, we decided not to do it. However, there is one reason, which actually has nothing to do with the genetic abnormalities, which you may want to do. And you have to do this through PGS or through genetic testing, is if you want to know the sex of the embryos. Apparently, they can only tell the sex of the embryos, boy or girl, if you do PGS or some sort of genetic testing. And so if you're a person who, I have to have a little girl or I have to have a little boy or whatever, then, and you care to that extent, then you may want to just do it just so you can know the sex of the embryos, because that is also determined during that point. Although I know what I would prefer, of course, just a healthy baby. That's what, you're supposed to say. And of course, at the end of the day, that's all I would want. But I'm not the type of person who would want to do a gender reveal or anything like that. Like, I'd like the good old fashioned surprise at the hospital situation. So even if we, like, it's a small part of me that would have liked to have known the sex of the embryos. But think about it. If you know the sex of the embryos and you implant the embryos too, and they're little girls or a little boy or something, and then they don't, you transfer them and they don't implant, it seems like it would be harder to disconnect yourself from that. At least to me, I would think. Like, if I thought about the embryos by, oh, this is my son or my daughter, oh, my little girl or my little boy, then if they don't implant, not that it's not a loss if you don't know, it just seems like, it seems in a way to me that it's almost like you've attached yourself. And so for me right now, until I at least get a positive pregnancy test, I'm trying my best not to be attached. I know it's a thing that happened. It's a big thing. I'm not acting like it's nothing. It's just that I don't want to feel devastated or, you know, go through a depression or some sort if they don't implant. So I'm trying to still, you know, I know what's going on. I know what happened. I'm processing that. I know, you know, I could be pregnant. I could not be pregnant, but I don't want to, you know, push myself into any sort of emotional, you know, wall or something, or have myself, you know, locked into something where I'm sitting here for the last 2 weeks like, oh, my little girls or my little boys or my babies or my, you know, I mean, it's bad enough that I transferred too. So, you know, occasionally I see something, or I see, you know, baby stuff, and I'm thinking, oh, twins, you know, do I need to, you know, what kind of twin stroller do I, and, you know, that may not even be a possibility. So for me, you know, I'm trying not to focus on that as much. Although my mom said to me the other day, because I have a really bad habit of not eating enough, especially during the day, but I haven't been working out, so I feel like it's a little more justified now. And so my mom said, well, you know, you got to be mindful. You could be eating for 2. And I said, well, for 3, if you want to be technical about it. But, you know, I try not to think about that. I don't think about eating for 2. I do have a little bit of an increased appetite given the progesterone shots, I believe. And I know that's another side effect. So I chalk everything up to side effects of progesterone. So it's hard because I do have this increased appetite. Yeah, I haven't been exercising because I'm trying to take it easy during these 2 weeks. I am excited to be able to exercise again, just because I think it would have helped me de-stress somewhat during this process. But at the same time, it would have caused stress, because if the test was negative, I may have thought maybe it was because you exercise too much. So it's better that I just not do it, and, you know, not try to have that as a possible reason, even if it's, you know, wasn't the reason. So, so I am looking forward to being cleared to exercise next week. And for, you know, assuming if the test was positive for the first trimester, I do plan to go back to my normal exercise routine, you know, to the extent, I mean, you could do pretty much high intensity workouts the first trimester, and, you know, maybe even some into the second. So as long as I can, and it's okay, I will be returning to my exercise routine. So I am pretty excited about that. And I hate exercising, but it's a necessary evil for me. So I think that's really it. Just wanted to kind of talk about the genetic testing before I have my results during my 2-week wait, which will be over early next week. And I'm trying to stay detached, but I don't know. You know, everyone has their own way of dealing with it. And, you know, I don't want to, I know me, And I can be very emotional at times, and I don't want to, spike up or down either way over the results, especially given this is my first cycle. So every step of this has been completely new to us. And, I know there's some old pros out there who, just know how to do everything and can explain everything to you, but we're kind of just finding it out as we go along. And, it's been a great process. Not one that I would like to continue on, but it has been great learning process. And it has taught me a lot about myself and about fertility and infertility and just women in general and our roles in society and what we think we need to be complete and how we want our futures and the control that we have over our lives and our family sizes and wanting to have it all. I know I personally wanted to have it all. I wanted to be a career woman first and then a wife and mother. Not necessarily in that order for those two, maybe mother, wife, whatever. But, growing up, all I ever wanted to do was, be a career woman, be a boss. So that was always my focus. And so I really want to be able to have it all. I'm like, why can't I? Claire Huxtable did it. Why can't I have it all? Let's not get into the Bill Cosby thing, though. So anyway, on that note, I will continue to keep you updated on what's happening and look forward to sharing with you soon. Pray for me if you do. And if not, at very least, please wish me luck.